Okay, so this is the third in the series of Cormac MacCarthy and All the Pretty Horses. We were just talking about the archetype of the American Adam and the idea that you have a protagonist who is situated in this expansive, incredibly powerful, and beautiful, majestic, sublime landscape, which is the American wilderness. And that if one has enough character and enough drive and a good enough heart, maybe, that one can reclaim or find one's place in paradise once again. So critics have taken the Adam and Eve myth and sort of added to it by situating this or resituating the myth of the Garden of Eden into the Americas. And so, in essence, what you have is a retelling of the Eden story. And if you look, I'll try to zoom in here. Ooh, it's kind of hard to do without screwing up my. Oops, something happened here. Let me pause and then I'll fix this. Okay, I got it back on the screen here. Now, if we look here at this, this is an old piece of iconography, and you see a lot of things happening here. You see Jesus Christ on the crucifixion. You see the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You see the serpent. You see Eve. You see Mary. The overall sentiment I interpret is this idea that the Virgin Mary and Christ have repaired the damage that was caused by the transgressions of the first humans in the Garden of Eden. So if we work off of that mythological pattern, that Christ does open the way to some sort of restoration and this reconvening, this reconnection with the Garden of Eden or with paradise, then we can understand this the American Adam archetype a little bit more, because critics are showing that humans' relationship with wilderness is given a second chance when we see the expansion of the Western Europeans and others as they start colonizing the New World. And so the myth that we bring along with us is this idea that perhaps the wilderness is going to be a way to recreate harmony. And the only way that that can exist, though, is through the suffering and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And we all know that that is pretty. When you look at the details of the crucifixion and the suffering of Jesus, which happened according to the theology on behalf of the humans, it's the fall of civilization and the sins of our forefathers, the original sins that separated us from the wonders and the perfection of creation. That was repaired to some extent when Jesus offered himself to be crucified on the cross. And not only to be crucified, but to suffer a very horrendous and in some depictions, a very bloody death. But it was only a temporary death because in 3 days he was resurrected. I wanted to note that this is from a cathedral in Mexico, and a lot of the iconography that we see in rural or not rural, but throughout Mexico, um, is very heavy on the blood imagery. So that that I think is a way into understanding the history of the land of Mexico from the very get-go, from the discoveries made by Columbus and other early explorers. I mean, the first thing that they wanted to do was to try to completely dominate and overcome and overrule the Aztec civilization. And we also know that the Aztecs themselves weren't necessarily that peaceful. There's a lot of evidence that they were heavy into human sacrifices. It was both cultures, that of the American or the Spanish conquistadors, and then the native Aztecs. They were both very warlike and bloody cultures. So it makes sense that there is this Christian tradition that emerges in Mexico that emphasizes blood and gore and whatever spiritual awareness that might come out of a recognition of the profound suffering that humans go through, and also a very intense longing for a transcendence from that suffering, and then a lingering philosophical and existential question that Cormac MacCarthy, I think, goes very deep into. And John Grady, I think, this is why I think he's so appealing, is that he holds out for a long time, even arguably to the end of the novel and then the other books that follow. He never gives up his faith and his belief that there is a possible redemption, that there is a avenue to return and recreate this paradise, the reunification with the Garden of Eden, the settling of the score with God and the balance of our sins, the reconnecting with between Adam and Eve, this recommuning, all of this very paradisical stuff. There is a potential for that, and I think John Grady believes in that, and that drives him. And in a way, that could be his fatal flaw, or it could be a characteristic that makes him endearing and extremely powerful and compelling. And beneath all of this, in the setting of the story, are lots of allusions to the suffering of Christ. And if you, like I was saying before, if you look at the iconography and the statues, the depictions of Jesus in Mexican culture, there is a profound emphasis on the bloodiness and the suffering of both Christ and of Mary. And it's interesting to note that John Grady is going to himself take on this suffering, and that becomes part of his quest, which ultimately is to see if he can make this reparation and this reconnection to Eden, and how much suffering can he can he endure in order to achieve this. So we have to wait and see how he comes out at the end of the novel. So that concludes the third installment here, and I hope you have a lot of questions about this. I hope this kind of gives you some themes and images, symbols, patterns to observe when we read through the story, and to give you a context about some of the allusions or some of the influences that are helping to structure this novel, and also help us to see the ways that Cormac MacCarthy is really pushing forward and evolving this idea of the Bildungsroman in a modern context.